All right, so we're going to try to cover as much as we possibly can between the end of World War II and sort of the end of the Cold War. Um, we will hit most of these points in sort of small amounts and in pieces as we kind of work through this unit. But this will give you kind of a general overview of the whole thing before we start here. All right, so I did this PowerPoint like social, political, religious, intellectual, technological, economic, like we normally did. So it's going to bounce around quite a bit. It's not going to go in chronological order, but hopefully you can kind of follow along. All right, so for social things, uh, what's going to become evident over time is that there are going to be large differences between Eastern and Western Europe that are going to develop as a result of the Cold War. Okay, and so this Iron Curtain that is going to, metaphorically divide Europe between East and West is eventually going to become, a very, uh, I don't want to say this. I mean, it goes from being small differences at the beginning to that over time, like these distinct differences are going to develop. We talk about, uh, you know. Consumer products and social norms with education. I mean, there are a bunch of things, okay? And so just understand, and the reason I guess I start with this is that, depending on the type of question you could get with regards to like the Cold War, is you always want to be aware of the fact that like does the question necessitate like a different answer for East and West, okay? So just be aware of that. All right, so moving on. So Clement Attlee, who is going to be the Labour Party leader in Britain, he's going to be very important. You should know Clement Attlee. He's the one really responsible for creating the welfare state in Britain after World War II. He takes over after Winston Churchill at the end of the war. And what's going to happen with this is there's going to be many industries that are going to be nationalized, even though I think it was like 75% of the industries in Britain are going to still remain private. The government's going to provide health care, it's going to provide free schooling. And what's important to note about the welfare state that develops after World War II is that like much of like the welfare programs that were developed in the late 1800s in response to kind of like the worst effects of industrialization were largely targeted at like factory workers and the poor, the elderly. And what's interesting about the welfare state after World War II is that these welfare programs are meant to increase the quality of the middle class life. So like, when we talk about free healthcare, we talk about free public education and university. Those are things that are like affecting all Europeans. Okay, and much of these changes are going to happen by Christian Democrats in France and Germany. One of the other huge changes in society in Europe after World War II is there's a massive increase in immigration of what they'll call guest workers to Europe. And this happens for a couple reasons. One, I mean, there's lots of jobs available to rebuild. That kind of coincides with a shortage of men because of all the death from the war. And so, like, there's jobs, and Europeans need more workers, and so they sort of happily go along with these large increases in immigration. It took them, millions of people. And also, like, the expansion of social welfare programs also makes living in these countries more appealing. Okay, and so, if you know that you can find a job and that the government is going to, take care of you, that's a double positive for increasing immigration. Now we'll come back to that. We'll spend a whole day talking about how does this immigration like affect the way that Europeans define themselves? Like, what does it mean to be a Frenchman, or what does it mean to be British? Especially because many of these immigrants, especially with France and Britain, are going to be immigrating from like old colonies, and so like they'll speak French or English, and they'll have some bits of like French or British culture, and so um, it's like is a French Algerian immigrant really French, or is he Algerian? Like, how do we define that? And so that becomes a big issue, especially once we get later into um, the 80s and 90s, where uh, because of resurgence of conservative governments, like these issues and economic problems, these issues become more pronounced. Um, Middle class society is in Europe is going to really define this like post war society, the economic prosperity, the education, this just like expansive middle class. And the same thing with American history is like you just see like a growth in the importance of the middle class and politics aimed at the middle class, and society that kind of revolves around the middle class. Um, we see a counterculture movement that's really going to develop in the 1960s in response to um, slow decolonization movements, the Vietnam War. They were a generation that hadn't experienced war, and so they're going to respond really strongly to these sort of pushes, like especially so like France, for example, is going to fight a war with Algeria in 1958 that's going to be really gruesome and prolonged. Um, and so they're really responding to their parents' generation. We'll talk more about that specifically one day. Um, Society, we also like see a solidarity movement, so we're going to talk about this is a really good example of uh, like anti-communist teaching and the spread of anti-communism throughout like the 70s and 80s leading up to like the collapse of the Soviet Union. It also is interesting because it kind of coincides with religious changes. So we'll talk some about like how like religion and Christianity are going to change after the Vatican II. Um, and so, just keep that kind of in the back of your mind. If we look at political, we'll have a couple slides on political stuff because we're going to do a lot here. You need to understand that like World War II, after World War II, we go through a huge phase of decolonization. That's super important. Okay, so we see a fading nationalism in Europe, and we see a renewed nationalism in these former colonies. We see a push for racial equality, and I just think overall, like a desire to continue imperialism really fades amongst this new generation, um, and that like the ideas of imperialism and the white man's burden and sort of racial superiority and social Darwinism, those all kind of start to fade away with each new generation. And so India is probably the first, not probably, India is the first country to break away from, their mother country. That independence movement was largely pushed by Gandhi and really starts during World War II. Now what's interesting about India is that it's eventually going to split into Pakistan and India, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You have decolonization movements in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, and then you're going to see the French lose in a war for independence in the 1950s to the Vietnamese. And then America kind of takes over, not wanting the Vietnam to switch to a communist country. We're going to see creation of Israel be a big deal in the Middle East. We'll talk about wars in the Middle East because of this sort of conflict over Israel. The Suez Canal becomes a real hot topic once Nasser takes over in Egypt and aligns himself with the Soviet Union. And then I briefly just kind of touched on that, but Algeria, you're going to see like a war for independence in Algeria because France doesn't want to give up Algeria as a colony. But sort of overall, like by the late 60s, most every country in Asia and Africa had received independence, with a couple exceptions. I know like Portugal was slow to give up its colonies, but for the most part, every other European country by the 1960s had given up control. And obviously that's a huge deal, not only for the strength of Europe and the sort of prominence of Europe and power of Europe, but also just like a changing world that we live in. After the war, a big political change with collective security and international relations was the creation of the United Nations. We've talked a lot about that, so I'm just going to kind of jump by. When we talk about sort of Cold War causes of the Cold War, remember the biggest thing is that Stalin sort of takes back his promise to give Eastern European countries or allow them to have free elections. So remember, there's two really important conferences at the end of World War II. The first one at Yalta, where Stalin said, these countries were liberating from Nazi control. We'll give them their independence. And then later on in Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference is where Stalin goes against his word and informs Truman and Churchill that won't be happening. And so what ends up happening is by 1948, communists had instituted one-party states, or like basically communist-controlled states across Eastern Europe. Only Yugoslavia was not dominated by the Soviets, which is kind of just like a little trivia fact. We've talked a lot about how Berlin was cut in really to four parts, but really in half, with East and West, and then Germany's cut into four parts, but really importantly just East and West. Berlin's going to consistently be a topic of controversy between the Soviets and the West. In the Berlin airlifts in 1948 and 49, and then in the late 50s, Khrushchev actually gave the West like a 0 hour to remove their presence from West Berlin and to give up control of West Berlin, and the Americans and the France and Britain never capitulate to that, and so it ends up being a continued conflict until 1961 when East Germany decides to build the Berlin Wall around West Berlin and basically not allow their people to use West Berlin to escape. U.S. policy in the Cold War is really defined by containment and the Truman Doctrine. They're going to do whatever they possibly can to help countries stop communism from spreading. And so like we're going to see containment policy in action in Korea and Vietnam. But Truman Doctrine, money and weapons also go to Greece and Turkey after the war, which is important. In 1949, NATO is going to be created. And so in 1955, the Soviets going to create the Warsaw Pact. So you should realize there's kind of a back and forth. It's just the same thing. So like as the Western European countries are creating like the EEC and different like economic unions after World War II, the Soviets are going to create what's called what's it, ComCon? I don't even remember what ComCon stands for, but like Western Europe is going to become more unified as a result of this Cold War and the struggles of World War II through economic unions and political unions. The same thing's going to happen with the Soviet Union and its satellite states. So ComCon is the economic union, the Warsaw Pact is the political union. In 1949, the Cold War really takes off just because the Soviets test their first nuclear weapon, and so like the balance of power is much closer than that sort of first part of the Cold War. In the early 1950s, you see the Korean War. U.S. and China almost go to war. In 1953, Stalin's going to die. He's going to be replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, who's going to make reforms to sort of stop Stalin's oppressive system. And so this is called de-Stalinization. So the five-year plans end. That Khrushchev's going to go a long way to like remove like the cult of Stalin that had really emerged in the Soviet Union. And this actually improved relationships between the Soviet Union and the satellite states. In 1956, the Hungarian uprising. This is really important because the Hungarians wanted and tried to get the United States to help them sort of liberate themselves from Soviet control, and the Soviets go in and violently put down the revolution. And so this was kind of a warning to all other satellite states, is that like if you try to revolt, we will violently crush your rebellion, and many people will die. Um, the sort of political reality in the 60s is that we come very, very, very close to nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. What's going to end up happening is that Khrushchev and Kennedy are going to make a deal that Khrushchev's going to take the missiles out of Cuba, and the United States is going to take their missiles out of Turkey, and so they kind of reach an agreement. The problem is that with the handling of Berlin in the late 50s, with the whole like, hey, America, you got to leave, or we're going to go to war with you, and then Khrushchev doesn't follow through with that, and then many Soviet leaders thought that Khrushchev had been too soft on the United States and the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in '64, Khrushchev is ousted, and he's going to be replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. And so Brezhnev is going to kind of re-Stalinize the Soviet Union. And a good example of that is like in 1968, in what was called the Prague Spring. It's like some revolutions that break out in Czechoslovakia. And what they wanted is they didn't even want like a full revolution. They just wanted to have like socialism without the totalitarianism. And so like their whole motto was like socialism with a human face, and they sought to implement reforms and to like loosen the control of the government over people's lives. And what ends up happening is that these protests kind of turn into a revolution, and then Soviet troops come in and like brutally invade Czechoslovakia. Again, many people are killed, and this is really important because after this, the Soviet Union issue was like the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in any of their satellite countries whenever they needed to, and they could do basically whatever they wanted to. And so that was a big turning point in the Cold War, and especially with the Soviet Union and the relationship between the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. At the same time, Willy Brandt, who's going to be the leader of West Germany, is going to begin to try to reach out to like East Germany and like create better relationships between East Germany and West Germany, and also just West Germany and the rest of Europe. And so this is like going to significantly improve relationships in Europe. So we go through this period of kind of like a détente, where like that period, that détente is like French word to relax. And so following the Cuban Missile Crisis, all the way up to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79 and '80, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the Soviet Union and Western Europe and the satellite states are all going to get better. Really outside of that Prague Spring incident. And like a hallmark of that is they're actually going to sign arms limitation treaties. So SALT is like strategic arms limitation treaty. So they're going to sign 2 of those, even though the second one never goes into effect. We'll talk about this sort of periods of conservative rule in the 1980s, with Margaret Thatcher being probably the most noteworthy European conservative leader. It's also a time when Ronald Reagan's president of the United States. But Thatcher is someone you need to know in European history. So she becomes prime minister in 1979. She's going to sort of advocate for a hardline military positions. She's going to be anti-social welfare state, so a lot of like the social welfare programs she's going to dismantle. She's also going to privatize some industries in England, and so Thatcher is someone we'll come back to and we'll talk more about, but you need to understand. So she's kind of like your prototypical conservative in European history in the 1980s. All right, so let's talk about getting here to like the end of the Cold War and the downfall of the Soviet Union. So in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev is going to become the leader of the Soviet Union. He's going to promote 2 things, perestroika and glasnost, which perestroika means like to restructure, And what that was is that he was wanted to restructure the sagging Soviet economy by becoming more of like a free market. So he wants to infuse some capitalism into the system, much like Lenin did with the new economic policies after the Russian Civil War way back in the 1920s. He also wanted to open Soviet society. So glasnost meant, is like literally is to open. And so like he wanted to like sort of loosen the strangle grip that the Soviet government had over individual liberties. Now, what's going to happen is both policies are failures for the Soviet Union. Um, the economy, when the government kind of takes its foot off the gas pedal, the economy is going to dramatically decline. And so the economy is in ruins. And now that society is more open, people start to really voice their frustrations with the economic problems. And then the economic problems are going to, boil into bigger protests. And so like this all kind of backfires on Gorbachev. And so eventually like these two policies are what are going to lead to um, the downfall of the Soviet Union, the independence of the Soviet satellite states, and so on. Um, and so what's going to happen is that in 1989, there's going to be a number of revolutions that break out, and the Soviet Union basically just like lets them, like declare their independence. Polish Solidarity was the first party to declare its independence, and then sort of from there, it's going to trigger a wave of freedom movement. So the Berlin Wall is going to fall in 1989. Like East German government's going to collapse, and Germany is going to be unified a year later. In Czechoslovakia, they had what's called like the Velvet Revolution, because it was there was no actual fighting. And so most Eastern European countries are going to get their independence in 1989, 1990, and then the Soviet Union is going to come to an end in 1991. All right. Um, so there's going to be problems in Yugoslavia though. So like this is the one incident where like we want to talk about how like problems that come out of like the fall of the Soviet Union. The first one here is really important because that not only is there a lot of war and death, but there's also like a state-sponsored genocide, and the UN had to get involved in Yugoslavia, a, a, I think 2 times, and so what's going to happen is that this collapse of the Soviet Union is going to cause like a new wave of nationalism to go through like the Balkan Peninsula. All right, so when we talk about the fall of the Soviet Union, the cost of protecting and maintaining control of the satellite states is going to be too high. The cost of search the Cold War is going to be too high. So some people will say that like Ronald Reagan's policies helped bankrupt the Soviet Union, bring about the Cold War. So what? And then throughout the 1980s, Reagan is going to continually sort of re-up this arm race with the Soviet Union. After like the SALT treaties that had been passed in SALT 1 and SALT 2 in the 1970s. And so like that, a lot of people point to Reagan's arms race like that, like he basically forces the Soviet Union to spend so much money it like bankrupts them. That also coincides with like a general economic crisis during the 70s and early 80s, like undermines the economy in really across Europe, really across the world. And so these calls for reforms are going to become louder in part due to these economic problems. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved into 15 separate republics. Russia's progress in the 90s was slow and painful. I think we still see the effects of that. I mean, shoot, Russia's about to have I'll put democratic in air quotes, election, this week, and so like Putin's reign in Russia kind of shows the sort of carryover effect of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, and totalitarianism in Russia, and so that's always present. And we're also going to see in the 90s, the Russians are going to have problems with anti-Islamic um, uh, actions in Chechnya. Um, Speaking of religion, so throughout this Cold War period, Europe is going to become much less religious, um, and that really is a key separating point between the United States and Europe religiously after World War II. Is that um, Europe is going to become much more secular uh, over the last like 70 years, and we're in America, and in some parts we're actually becoming more religious. So, and that maybe is not across the whole country, but certain parts. One of the other big changes in religious history in this sort of Cold War period is Vatican II. It's easily the most important council of the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent, which, if you remember, the Council of Trent um, was sort of like the culmination of the Counter Reformation. Uh, and so what that did is it allowed for the use of vernacular in Catholic liturgy. So it's not until like the late 1960s that Catholic churches start giving mass in the language of whatever country it's in. So it goes from being Latin to English, for example. And they also make an important change to the Catholic Church as the one true church, but Catholics were to respect other Christians. So still obviously um, advocating that the Catholic Church is the true Christian church, but it allowed for religious toleration between Christian denominations, which was a big step forward. All right, so um, following World War II, we're going to jump here to intellectual stuff. Following World War II, we're going to talk about existentialism spreading, which really kind of starts after World War I, but then becomes much more prominent and popular after World War II, especially because after World War II, we're going to see a huge growth in attendance of college and universities, and so we're just going to see a better educated population. Um, Jean-Paul Sartre is like the leading French existentialist in Europe. Someone that's a name you should probably know. There's also going to be new and important art movements that are going to develop in Europe after World War II with like surrealism, um, and modern art. We'll talk more about that actually in class one day. We'll have like a little art day. But you should know that stuff. Um, Intellectually speaking, there's going to be like a brain drain that happens because of the success of the American economy after World War II, and how much money the government in America is going to spend on research and development, along with major American corporations. The U.S. is going to attract many of Europe's best scientists during the 50s and 60s. And so, to counteract this, European governments are going to respond pretty strongly in order to try to keep their best and brightest in the country. I just kind of mentioned this, but access to higher education has become much more widespread following World War II, and so this much better educated population is going to have important societal effects, and intellectual effects as far as like the culture as a whole goes. We're also going to see the growth of a counterculture in the 1960s and rebellion of younger Europeans against this World War II generation and their sort of, well, I would say like young World War II, really even the world like um, in some ways they're responding to the kids who grew up in World War II because those ends up being the parents. Um, and so this counterculture is going to grow against like the materialism that defines like the 50s and the 60s in the West, and how like it's all about consumer products. And this next slide we're going to talk about like the gadget revolution is like everything is about consumerism and materialism and consumption, and and so this younger generation is really going to rebel against that, especially once we get to the late 1960s, like in '68, there's just open protest, and a lot of it has to do with the Vietnam War too, and protest against American involvement in Vietnam. Uh, the de-Stalinization after Stalin's death in '53, so in the late '50s and very early part of the '60s under Khrushchev, is there's going to be some flowering of art and literature and movies and books and all that kind of fun stuff in Eastern Europe, because a lot of it's very critical of Stalin's government, Stalin's policies, and that was acceptable under Khrushchev, was to be critical of Stalin. Um, as far as technology goes, I just kind of mentioned this gadget revolution that's going to happen. So there's a tool or an appliance or whatever that you know if the West goes about trying to create something for everything, and so and a lot of it has to do with like expanded electricity too after World War II. But I mean that you guys all live that every day, so it's nothing new. We're going to see nuclear technology spread. In '52 and '53, the U.S. and the Soviets developed their hydrogen bombs. In 1957, the Russians launched the first satellite into space, Sputnik, and this is going to begin the space race. In 1961, the Soviets send the first person into space, Yuri Gagarin. And really, until the United States gets to the moon, the Soviets were sort of winning the space race. But that sort of shows the impact of U.S. spending on technology and research. There's going to be spy planes, and there's just going to be spying in general, massive amounts of spying. And these effects of this sort of space technology have like a trickle-down effect. So a lot of the technology that ends up, being developed by the space programs ends up finding its way into regular day life. If we talk about economics, so like the big thing in Western Europe is that we see a massive economic recovery, and really, so for the first couple of years, Britain, France, and Germany are going to be struggling massively. And the U.S. came in what was called the Marshall Plan, and from I think '48 to '51 and '52. The U.S. is going to spend $13 billion in these economies in Western Europe, and obviously is very successful. And then so basically from the early '50s through the '60s, there's this sort of like long period of economic prosperity that really is going to help define this sort of post-war period. After World War II, Stalin's going to reinstitute his 5-year plans. They're very oppressive. Even after the war, Stalin's going to kill more than 12 million Soviet citizens through forced labor, slave labor in these gulags. And I mean, that in the context, understand that. I mean, he's going to kill 12 million more of his people after, 20 million plus just died in World War II. And so after the war, like there's this sort of brief blip in like national pride in Russia. That allows the government to be less oppressive, but then Stalin immediately starts to reinstitute these very unpopular economic policies, and he becomes very sort of totalitarian and kind of doubles down on his brutality. And so, like by the time that Stalin dies, like he's very unpopular in the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellite states. After Stalin dies, Khrushchev's going to create a ghost plan. Which is really going to just shift from, how like in Stalin's 5-year plans, much of like the resources were directed at heavy industries in the military, obviously. And so what Khrushchev's going to realize is that, the quality of Soviet life had been sort of lagging behind the West because they were directing so much money and resources into these heavy industries and military that, like the quality of Russian consumer appliances and consumer goods and agriculture had declined. And so Khrushchev's really trying to show that communism could be superior to capitalism by producing a higher standard of living and higher quality goods. and as far as the shift goes, it's moderately successful. The problem is that the heavy industry and military spending were the key factors behind like the Soviet economy. And so when he pumps the brakes on spending in those regards, the Soviet economy is going to start to slowly, decline. And by the time that we get to 63, 64, when Khrushchev is removed from power, Brezhnev is going to have to re-Stalinize to some degree to make sure that the economy starts going again. Now the problem is going to be is that like they try to do this at a time when like the world economy starts to really lag and decline, and so like this period from like the late 60s to the 1980s is really like this period of economic stagnation, not only in the Soviet Union but across the world. And so, I just kind of mentioned that this economic downturn in the 70s is going to, the main cause behind that is going to be increasing oil prices. So you can thank OPEC for that. And so this is going to cause a number of economic changes. Most importantly, probably that, like for Western Europe anyways, is that like we're going to see, conservatives gain control of politics in most of those countries, and they're going to start to trim back parts of the welfare state. They're going to privatize government-controlled industries. They're going to reduce government spending, which has the effect of, when you reduce government spending, oftentimes it's in social welfare programs. If we want to, you should be able to trace the creation of the European Union. We're gonna, again, this is one thing we'll probably spend a day on talking about, but you should be able to do this. Okay, so if you got this question, you could make this argument. So the first steps towards the European Union was the European Coal and Steel Community, was created in 1950, and what this did is so like the creation of coal and steel was going to be shared by 6 countries. I think it was like France, Germany, or West Germany, sorry, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands. I forget who the 6th one was, but so these 6 economies were going to be bound together so that they couldn't go to war with each other. So like they all relied on each other for and they sort of co-produce both coal and steel. And so that's a really important step towards the first step towards the European Union. That those 6 countries, and most important of those 6 is obviously France and West Germany working together. But what they're going to do is they're going to create the EEC, the European Economic Community, in 1957, which was going to create basically a common market. So they reduced tariffs among European countries. Now, however, in the 1960s, de Gaulle is going to be, I think in 58, de Gaulle is elected as leader of the French government, and he removes France from this. He removes France from NATO. He created a French nuclear program. And so like de Gaulle becomes very antagonistic of European unity. So in the 60s, we kind of take a big step backwards. But in the 70s and 80s and obviously in 1990, we take the biggest step. But there's like just continued sort of economic cooperation. And in 1991, the European Union was officially created. And they created a single currency. It was the euro. And now that the European Union, so like during the 1990s, they went through a couple waves in early 2000s, they went through waves of increased membership. So now, there's 28 countries in the European Union. And obviously, like in the last year, we had to go through the whole like Brexit thing. So just be mindful of that. We've already kind of talked about this one stuff. I'm gonna leave this here too because I might have another question about this. At the end of this, I want you to answer these questions. Okay, so this is your homework for tomorrow: is answer these. 9 questions, and bring these to class tomorrow.